Thank you for the opportunity for me to be able to speak at this joint symposium between ACerS and the European Ceramic Society. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to talk about our research on using advanced scanning transmission electron microscopy techniques and data analysis for the development of electronic ceramics. So I'd like to point out my co-authors on this, a few of my current and past students, Stephen Funai, Nicole Creange, and Matt Cabral, and also a very strong collaboration we've had with Jim LeBeau, who is now at MIT, and his group. So I want to acknowledge their contributions to this work. So what I'm going to talk about today is really focusing on what we and other people in the microscopy community have been doing to advance what we call real space crystallography. And hopefully I'll show you some of the advantages of this approach to understanding crystallography and how it can complement other scattering techniques that we're used to using to probe crystal structure. And I'm going to give a couple of examples that really focus on what we've done over the past about 4 years in collaboration with the LeBeau group on the PMN system in particular. And we've also done some work on PMN-PT. And then where we're moving and working on right now, where there's some more challenges to more complex crystal structures beyond the perovskite structure. And that's looking at some tungsten bronze systems. So focusing in where we started, which was really looking at PMN, this is the type of material where there's really a need to understand local structure and how the local structure relates to the global structure. And this is the local structure, and the heterogeneity in that is very important for the properties, in this case, the relaxer behavior of these types of materials. So our approach has been to use electron microscopy, aberration corrected STEM, where there are very important experimental attributes of this approach, which have to do with the microscope stability, accurate calibration, and signal to noise. And a lot of this has really been improved over the past couple of years by using techniques, post-processing techniques, to help you improve these characteristics of the experiment. One of those techniques that Jim LeBeau developed that we've used quite a bit has been to take, images at different scan angles and then do post-processing to get rid of a lot of distortions and drifts of the sample. And if you do this properly, you can get down to 1 to 2 picometer precision in the atomic column coordinates, which allows you to really do this, what we call real space crystallography. And this is just an image showing that if you have pretty severe drift, as a function of time, and you change the rotation angle, then the distortion of the lattice depends upon the scan angle. And once you've done the correction, you then see that you can get rid of that distortion. You can add up number of images and get better signal to noise. So that's been our main approach. We've in our group implemented in a couple of fashions. But it's also good to remember that to think about what we see in a final image. We see an array here of bright spots in this two-dimensional image, but how does that actually relate back to what we want to know, which is the structure of our sample? And that very much depends upon the electron optics and the probe formation, how the electrons scatter within the sample, and then ultimately how we collect the data, and over what scattering angles we are collecting the scattered intensity. So knowing all 3 parts of the scattering and ultimately image formation are really important. This is a representative image of a high angle angular dark field image, where we're primarily seeing the heavy elements in the material scattered to high scattering angles. And this is a classic perovskite material where we can distinguish, looking down a 1O ozone axis, the A from the B cations. If we can do that based off of intensity, then we can separate the two sublattices into the A sublattices and B sublattices, and we can do statistics on them. So this is just looking at a nearest neighbor profile AA to or BB distances along two orthogonal axes, and we can look at the distribution of these intercolumn distances to tell us something about the structure. This is done along the X and the Y axis. This is averaged over the two, and we get a distribution. Okay, and this is for something like strontium titanate that has a very regular structure, and we'll show that as in contrast to other perovskites that have much more heterogeneity in both the chemistry and therefore local structure. So this is showing just a kind of a high-level overview of comparing something where here we've also plotted on the image the local AA distances or the local BB distances where there's a color coding to the annotations that are shown on the image. And we can already see when we get to PMN, first of all, there's a lot more heterogeneity in the local structure. And secondly, that if we separate on sublattices, we see most of that heterogeneity is on the A sublattice where the lead ions are sitting. And here's the overall distribution as well. So I think this is a really nice example where being able to quantify things on a sublattice basis provides you additional insight into the structure and where local structural heterogeneity is residing, and where we're getting off-centering that can lead to local polarizations in the structure. A couple of things I do want to point out, however, are that that again, this is going back to what you see in the image. How does it actually translate back into what the structure is in the material? And I think it's good to be careful about this. What these are in this slide are three image simulations of a material that has essentially the same structure. So we've generated a structure of PMN where the leads are displaced along in each unit cell along one of the 8111 variants, which is known that that's the average displacement from other scattering techniques. So our simulation said, well, we'll let the lead displace and where there's no correlation spatially with the other lead displacements. And what if we simulate the image? How does that change as a function here of the thickness of the sample? And what you'll see is what you measure, where the green arrows are telling you the mean displacement of the lead atoms from the center of mass of the surrounding B cations, that what you measure depends on the sample thickness. Okay, and what's happening is things are getting averaged out as the sample thickness is greater. And this is really due to dechanneling of the electron probe. And this is something we take into, we have to take into consideration when knowing under what conditions we can more directly interpret the data from the images and directly relate it back to the structure. And this just shows that at the top of the sample up here, we may have worked very hard to get a sub-angstrom electron probe, but by the time that the electrons propagate through the sample, we start to get significant amount of dechanneling, and that can depend upon, in this case, these are just two different models where we've put random displacements in the lead cations, and they, in this case, on the top, and that can help dechannel the probe faster. So we do have to understand these types of effects and also pay very critical attention to what the thickness of the sample is so that we understand these dechanneling phenomena. Okay. So the other thing I want to point out, I've shown you annular dark field images that give us cation displacements. You may also be aware that over, about the past 5 years, there's been a lot of attention paid to differential phase contrast imaging, where we look at the lower angle scattered electrons still. This is implemented in this case in a STEM-based geometry, and that by looking at the lower angle scattering, we are able to get information first about local electrostatic fields, and we have much higher sensitivity to light atoms such as oxygen, which is important for the perovskites. But still here, if we look at simulations again from strontium titanate, things like sample thickness are still important. And if we see as a function of thickness, by the time we get to 20 nanometers under these imaging conditions for simulated imaging conditions for strontium titanate, you'll see that we now have actually very little signal from the oxygens. So again, we need to be very mindful about the sample thickness and what role that plays into the final intensities in the image. Okay, so let me just show you that, if you do a good job with sample preparation, really understand under which conditions you can do more direct data quantification, the kind of information you can get. And I'm going to show you work that we've done on PMN, which is a relaxer-like material. And interestingly here for us is chemistry on the B sites where we have either magnesium or niobium. There is significant scattering contrast from these two transition metals based on their atomic number that's going to also give us chemical sensitivity in the image and allow us to correlate local chemistry with local structure. We will look at data for along two crystallographic directions, 001 and 011, which give us slightly different insight into the three-dimensional crystal structure. I'm going through some of this fairly quickly for time's sake, but most of this is published and therefore you can read for further details. One way we like to look at the data, and this is just a different way of presenting local structure, is to do a projected partial pair distribution function. So projected because, yes, this is a projected structure because we're doing STEM-based imaging, but we can also do partial pair distribution functions since we can sort out the A sublattice from the B sublattice in this case. And this is what we see with PMN, that is a function of distance. We look at the A's and the B sites, we see the first, second, third nearest neighbors, and what you notice is that there's much larger broadening on the A sublattice where the lead ions are sitting, as I mentioned before. This is a different way of presenting that data. The other thing we can do is look locally, and what I'm plotting here is local lattice parameter. So this is off the B sublattice, where we again have a color scale that tells us something about the local nearest neighbor distances or the local lattice parameter. And here on the lead sublattice, you see a much larger variability. So again, this is consistent with but a different way of presenting the data. But what's nice about this is that inside of these circles here are the B sublattice intensities. And you'll notice some of them, if you look very carefully, are brighter than others, and that correlates with how much niobium is in that column, okay, because of the atomic number and distance. And what we find is if we look at the local lattice constant versus the local intensity inside that unit cell, there's a very strong correlation, where the brighter the intensity, where we'd have more niobium present in the column, we see a relative expansion of the lattice constant as reflected down here in this schematic. And then if it's niobium rich, we have a lattice contraction. You'll see that things are fairly randomly distributed with no correlation on the other sublattice. So this is a nice demonstration of being able to connect local structure with local chemistry. The other thing that we can do is look at the spatial correlation of displacements. And so this is looking at where the green arrows are telling us about the local displacement of the lead ions. And what we see is that we have regions that appear to be correlated where the distances, the off-centering is correlated spatially. This is also reflected if I look at the standard deviation or the width of the peaks that we're in. Let me just go back a moment. In these pair distribution functions, if we look at how the width varies as a function of distance, and I plot that here, that we see that we get a plateau, and this plateau correlates with this size, and we see that we have correlated displacements of the lead over a length scale of about 1.5 nanometers. Another interesting attribute of PMN is, as I mentioned on the B sublattice, we have magnesium or niobium. They do have a propensity to order, and this is known. And we can also quantify this, and this is where we turn to this other zone axis where we have more sensitivity. where we have sensitivity to this type of chemical ordering. And I think even in these images, you can see very clearly that there are regions where we have these very dark columns, okay? And there is a spatial ordering of those. And if we look at the column intensities on those B sublattices, you see that we have this kind of checkerboard pattern that's telling us that we have ordering where we've got planes, 111 planes that are enriched in niobium in the red, and then we have ones that are enriched in relatively in magnesium that would appear in the blue. And this is all backed up by EDS data as well. And we've gone through and looked at the spatial distribution and done classification of taking the B sites into B1 and B2 depending on their intensity. In this classification scheme, we see that we have regions of ordering, and then if we look at the regions at the areas between the ordered regions, we see that they are that we're given as these green lines where numerically we couldn't assign them to either a B1 or B2 based on our mathematical criteria, but what those correspond to are antiphase boundaries. The other thing we've looked at is, can we quantify the degree of order? And we've done that and put it on a scale where the highest intensity, we have the most ordering, where we have very strong oscillations between bright and dark 111 planes, and therefore very strong ordering between the niobium and the magnesium. And we see that we have really what we call a graded ordered structure out to the antiphase boundaries. And we think that this is a mechanism where it lowers the energy of the antiphase boundaries by having the order metric actually converge at the antiphase boundaries. We've also done this iDPC imaging in PMN, and here's where now we have sensitivity to the oxygen columns, and we've been able to observe a number of interesting phenomena. First, we can quantify octahedral tilts. Okay, so these are actually, the way we're doing it here is just this oxygen, actually oxygen, B site oxygen. We can quantify the local tilt along different axes, and we see we get quite a bit of octahedral tilting, and that also there seems to be in regions a pattern to this where we have anti-correlated tilting. These antiphase octahedral rotations we can map out, and we have different ways of quantifying this that again are telling us now about local structure, but now with respect to the oxygen sublattices, which can be important. And then finally, what we're doing, and this is actually, because I'm going through this quickly, has been summarized in a very recent paper that came out in 2020, just about a month ago, is we can take these octahedral tilts, these structural parameters, and then correlate them again with the local chemistry signatures as reflected in the intensities of the B-site columns, and start to look at correlations between what's happening in the oxygen sublattice with what's happening chemically on the B sublattice, and that's pretty exciting. So I'll just make a couple of summary points. I think we've learned a lot from the PMN structure. In that last paper I referenced as well, we do some comparisons between PMN and PMN-PT, which is pretty interesting. But I think we've shown, and hopefully I've demonstrated to you today, the power of doing crystallography in real space is that we can separate things on a sublattice basis. We have in some instances the ability to correlate local structure with local chemistry, and also looking at ordering phenomena and being able to put an order metric on this so that we can look at the spatial distribution of, in this case, chemical ordering, and correlate that with local structure on the cation and the anion sublattices. So I'll spend a few moments, I've got a couple minutes left, it looks like, just talking about some of our ongoing and future efforts. And this is really looking at some more complex materials that have other interesting structural features that are still not completely well understood. And for this research, we've been actually turning to the tungsten bronze system, where again, overall, it's a much more complicated unit cell. There are also interesting ordering phenomena in this type of material and in the composition we've been looking at room temperature. These superlattice spots that you see in the diffraction pattern are actually incommensurate with the crystalline lattice. So there's incommensurate modulations that appear in this material that we're trying to understand at a deeper level. The structural complexity of this material offers some other challenges from the data quantification, and those are some of the things we're working on right now, and I'll just give you a little insight into where this is going. If we look at the tungsten bronze along the 100 type, sorry, the 001 type direction, you can see that that things don't sit on this kind of perfect grid where we can use some of the types of algorithms we used before to classify atom columns on either an A or a B sublattice as we did in the perovskite structure. So what we've done here is we've developed a classification scheme based on the local nearest neighbors and the local structure. And so if we know kind of the baseline average structure about the A1s, the A2, the B1s, and B2s, we've been able to code up an algorithm where we can automatically go in and do that classification to the sublattice site, and it's highly enabled for this structure, but because the nearest neighbor distances are distinct for each of these sublattices along this projection. Okay, and once we do that classification, we can do similar types of statistics that I showed you before. So this is the BSSN sublattice, and here again we're looking at these partial. It's not completely a pair distribution function. It's just looking at the nearest neighbor lengths between B1, B1, A1, A1, and the B2, B2, and we have the ability to look at these distributions, look for splitting in the structure that can have to do with octahedral tilt rotations in this material. So this has actually taken quite a bit of work to be able to do this automatic sublattice quantification classification. But once you do that, it gives you a lot of freedom to look at the statistics of the local structure in these more complex crystal systems. We've also been looking at other projections in the same material. So this is the 1-bar 1-0 type projection. And here this is plotted out as, again, a partial pair distribution function, and with the vectors, the real space vectors outlined here. And we can see again that depending on the sublattice, so the A1 or the A21 sublattices, the breadths of these distributions are quite different, okay? And that's going to allow us to get into more where the structural relaxations, how they're accommodated by the different, in this case, we're just looking at the cations right now, but how they're accommodated by the different cations. The other thing we started to do is realize the value of looking at the pair correlation functions, not just in a 1D plot as I showed before, but actually looking at them as 2D. So this is these are now real space vectors where we're looking at the partial correlation functions. And what we see is that these distributions are very anisotropic. Okay, so the distributions tend to be wider along these 1-1-0 type directions. Okay, the other, so you can see the smearing of the pair correlation functions along that crystallographic direction. The other thing that we find is that the distributions are not the same for, in this case, the first nearest neighbor along the 001 and the second nearest neighbor along the 001. Okay, so this is quite interesting. So this would tell us that we have more uncorrelated displacements to the first nearest neighbor. Interestingly, these aren't two separate peaks. It's really a distribution, a broad distribution from what we can see now. But then if we go out to the second nearest neighbor, those they're much more highly correlated. Okay, so we're still trying to understand completely this data, but there's a lot more information looking at this in a 2D plot. Okay. The other thing we've been looking at, you may have remembered that I said when I introduced this crystal structure at the very beginning, is that this composition actually has an incommensurate modulation. And that incommensurate modulation is given by this purple vector here. And what we find is that when we are along in real space, the vectors that correspond with that incommensurate modulation, that's where we see these very tight distributions. Okay, so we think we can also learn more about the incommensurate modulation, and we're looking at this on different sublattices, and it's not the same as you might expect on different sublattices. So I think that just gives you a little bit of a little peek into what we're working on now, and we're quite excited about the prospects for understanding more about local structure in these more complex crystal systems. But hopefully I've given you enough evidence that shows you really the value of STEM-based techniques in real space crystallography for looking at these local structural attributes. Okay. And I'll stop by acknowledging funding for the work, which came from a couple of sources, including the Center for Dielectrics and Piezoelectrics. We also made extensive use of the microscopes in the North Carolina State University Analytical Instrumentation Facility. And then a number of my students have been funded or at least interacted with a graduate traineeship that we have here. So thank you very much for your attention.